When I was in seminary, almost 40 years ago, I met became my best friend and still is. He's the priest at our Episcopal Church in Boise, and he's probably why my wife and I attend there. So I'm Presbyterian, but we have for several years since we moved to Boise attended there. When we moved to Boise from La Grande in 2004, my brother was the pastor at Southminster Church, and we attended there, but what I needed was a break from the Presbyterian setting because I had been leading Presbyterian worship for 20 years and I was in a transition in my own spirituality, and so I attended at the Episcopal Church. And I just had a special moment of appreciating Presbyterian worship. I'm having several of them this morning, but the one I just had was that we didn't have to sing every blessed verse of the hymn. We came to the end and we stopped. And all those years in the parish, we'd come down to the end of the service and I'd think, we've been here for an hour and 10 minutes, and I'd say, we're going to sing 1, 3, and 5, and we'd sing it. In the Episcopal Church, not only does the hymnal have many, many verses more of every hymn and verses you've never heard of before, but they sing every one. They never, ever omit a verse, even if the last verse, as often is the case, is identical to the first verse. It seems so unfair. It seems so unfair. So I thank you so much for just giving me that little moment of when we're done, we're done. We can just stop. I feel overdressed. I feel a little bit like I'm trying to sell you something. And so I thought, well, I'm going to doff either the jacket or the tie. And then during the welcoming time, a very nice lady complimented me on how well my tie went with my jacket. So I'm feeling a little caught. So I think we'll just stay with what we got. But I told my wife this morning, I don't know how long it's been since I put on a tie. It feels great. It's new. It feels different. I don't wear a tie typically to work. My typical work is office work now. It's funny that Ed called out the title because I actually never used that language. But I do manage the chaplains for the health system, kind of all across the way, and it's a largely administrative job. But my background before I came to St. Luke's in that role was hospice chaplaincy. That was between my time in the parish and my time doing this job. And so now when I do chaplaincy now at the hospital, I work with what's called the palliative care team, which is just a neighbor to hospice in its intent. It's spiritual care with people at the end of life, and I'm going to bring that in a little bit here. But first, I want to go back to when Aaron called me to preach today. Aaron, as you may know, did a seminar some weeks ago on centering prayer. In Boise. He took it from my buddy Dave Wetstein, the Episcopal priest that I was just telling you about, that is kind of at the church where we attend. And so I think it's because he had been studying what's called centering prayer, a contemplative approach to prayer, for a couple of days, that he learned that I also have that practice in my life. And so he called me and he said, would you do a sermon on prayer? And I said, sure, I'm happy to help. And then I called him back, or I emailed him and I said, do you all use the lectionary? He said, no, not necessarily. I said, okay, I'm really used to using the lectionary. I'm really used to looking at this schedule of texts for each Sunday and choosing one of those to preach on. And for me, preaching and sermon implies proclamation of the gospel, which may or may not be the same thing as a sermon on prayer. And so I felt a little bit caught, and I kind of waded into this and got part way in before I realized that's how I was feeling. So I chose from the lectionary texts for today, the Psalm 32, and it's on page 413 in your Pew Bible. I went and found one so that I'd have the same Bible you have. And I would ask you to pull it out, please. Unless you know already that it's too small a print and you're not going to be able to read it. I know that could be the case, but let's try to get one in front of everybody because we're going to read it together. And then I'll call out a few of the verses after we read it that to me feel like proclamation of the gospel, so that we have that. Psalm 32 on page 413. And what I'd like to do is alternate verses. I'll read a verse and then you all read a verse. And we'll go back and forth. It won't take too long. It's only about 11 verses long. Okay, would you do that with me? It feels kind of Episcopalian, doesn't it? Sorry. All right. So I'll start, and then you read this, and then you read the next verse. And I'll read it with you just so we all stay together. Here we go. Blessed is he whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sin is covered. Now you. Blessed is the man whose sin the Lord does not count against him, and in whose spirit is no deceit. My turn. When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. Now you. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. Then when I acknowledged my sin to you and did not cover up my iniquity, I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. Therefore, let everyone who is godly pray to you while you may be found. Surely when the mighty waters rise, they will not reach him. You are my hiding place. You will protect me from trouble and surround me with songs of deliverance. I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you and watch over you. Do not be like the horse or the mule, which have no understanding, but must be controlled by bit and bridle, or they will not come to you. Many are the woes of the wicked, but the Lord's unfailing love surrounds the man who trusts in him. Rejoice in the Lord and be glad, you righteous. Sing, all you who are upright in heart. Amen. Thank you. How are we? Are we good? All right. Here are the verses that kind of called to me in this. Back starting with verse 5. Then I acknowledged my sin to you and did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. That's pretty much gospel, isn't it? Kind of interesting. That could have come right out of Jesus' mouth. Well, the Psalms were Jesus' prayer book. I mean, when Jesus went to synagogue, when he went through worship, and by the way, they used a lectionary. When they got up to read the readings for the day, part of what they read was the Psalms, because since all the way back then and before, these verses, these poems, these songs about our life in faith talk about every aspect of our life. It's one of the classic forms of prayer is to read the Psalms. If you go to a monastery, they'll get together, those monks, about 5 times a day, and really all they do is read Psalms. And then it goes on, therefore let everyone who is godly pray to you while you may be found. And surely when the mighty waters rise, they will not reach him. And then this is the part that made me feel like prayer. For you are my hiding place. You will protect me from trouble and surround me with songs of deliverance. And so in those few verses, I found the gospel and I found what I recognize in prayer. So I like that text. And that's why we had it in front of us this morning. Well, I want to talk to you about prayer in many different ways, and I apologize for making the people in the front row crane your neck. I'm just trying to find the center of balance in the room. It's not up there for me, so I had to come down here, get a little closer to you. My 97-year-old dad prays on his knees every night before he goes to bed. At his bedside, it's one of my earliest memories, is seeing him on his knees praying. He lives up in Bellevue, Washington. So I called him yesterday in the midst of my truly prayerful preparation of a sermon on prayer. I called him because he's one of, when Moses says to God in the lectionary text last week, "Who shall I say sent me?" God said, "The God of your ancestors and your fathers, and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob." Well, so I called my father. And I said, "Why do you pray?" And he kind of giggled. It was such a pointed question. And he said, his answer surprised me. He said, "Well, it's just how I was taught. And it never occurred to me to stop." It just never occurred to me to stop. It reminds me of my mom years ago. She died about 7 or 8 years ago. But many, many years ago, my dad and I were engaged in one of our imponderable conversations about theology or philosophy or whatever, and they always kind of frustrated her. And I turned to her at one point at the kitchen table and I said, "Well, Mom, why do you believe in God?" And she said, "I wouldn't know how not to." So I want to honor a certain kind of spirituality that maybe underlies the prayer for many of us, is that God is so obvious and so present that it just is like words to God. Who's there? Something like that. Then my dad said something kind of interesting, kind of different. He said, when I was in the Air Force, this would be the Royal Canadian Air Force, he wanted to be a pilot, but blah, 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 too many pilots, or he couldn't see quite right or whatever, and so he was a navigator. But he flew in these B-17s and B-22s and that. And he said, before we ever went up in the air, I always said the Lord's Prayer. How about that? I always said the Lord's Prayer. So it became almost like a touchstone for him of safety, I think, because those planes were not all that safe. And of course, it was wartime. So they did lose a lot of their friends, and sometimes those planes went down. And he said those planes were a lot more dangerous back then. This is my dad, who worked for 30 years for Boeing. And then I, of course, had to say back to him, of course, unless you're flying in a 737 C-MAX, then you might want to say the Lord's Prayer. And he laughed. Why do you pray? Why do you pray? I would actually love to come through the wall for a moment and find out, because I don't know you very well. I haven't preached here before. I know this congregation, and I know Aaron well, and I've been in this building many, many times, but I don't know very many of you, and I feel like I need to know just a little more as we take the next steps in this conversation. Would anybody be willing to just say, and we're not looking for the right answer for everybody, I'm asking for your answer. Why do you pray, if you do? Anybody? Comfort. For comfort. For comfort. Yes, ma'am. For communion with God. Yes, ma'am.
Because my day goes rotten if I don't.
My day goes rotten if I don't.
I think it's because when I was young and didn't know the difference, my mother had me kneel and pray.
It sounds like you and my dad would get along really well on that one. It's how I was taught. I was taught to pray. All right? Anybody else like to say something about why do you pray? Yes, ma'am. To give thanks. Giving thanks to God out of gratitude. Yes?
See if I can get direction from God.
Seeking direction and wisdom. Okay. little bit of backlighting here, so I can't see you very well. Yes? To what? To draw closer to God. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
God and I speak to each other.
It's a conversation.
It is.
Okay.
Indeed.
All right. Okay. Well, some of you men teach. Oh, good. I was going to say, some of you women teach the men about why you pray. We got a man finally. Yes, sir. Why do you pray? Did you?
For forgiveness and guidance.
For forgiveness and guidance, much like the psalmist, who said, "When I kept silence." That just the verse before the one I called out. There's a verse that says, "When I kept silence, my body wasted away." It's like I had this sense of burden in me, but once I unburdened myself to God, that's when I began to feel comfort and forgiveness. Very good. So we pray for a lot of different reasons. Well, let's stay personal. Let's keep it personal for a minute. My almost 33-year-old son, 16 years ago, I guess, when he was about 16, 17, was diagnosed with Crohn's, which is a treatable but incurable disease, chronic disease. We thought he had stomach ache, that he was complaining, and then when we ended up realizing it was really in a lot of pain, we took him to the hospital, and I was thinking maybe appendicitis, maybe even a burst appendix. And then that night, as my wife and I laid in bed tearful, having received his diagnosis of Crohn's, I thought how much things can change in a day. This morning we thought he was just complaining. At what we thought was the worst part of the day, we thought, well, he's going to have surgery to have his appendix out. But that's not that uncommon. And now, dear God, I wish it had just been surgery to have his appendix out, because it's this disease that we don't know anything about. All we've heard is that he's going to have it for the rest of his life. It will mean many hospitalizations. It will mean several surgeries during the course of his life, most likely. And that's playing out. He's been in the hospital many times for pain management in those years, and has had a very major surgery, and probably will have more ahead. And I wanted more than anything for that not to happen to him. I remember also laying in bed that night thinking, Lord, he's a young man. Give this to me. I would gladly play this out for the next couple of decades and then die if that's where it goes. We were terrified of the disease. We didn't know what would happen. I would gladly take it. And I've never felt, it was so clear to me that if I could trade places with Kevin, I would. Not a no-brainer. And it was amazing to me, that sense of parental, that compelling love, because that was a huge thing to want. I thought I would be glad to take this on my own body if he could be clean, if he could be clear. But looking back on that time, other than that urgent sort of wistfulness about trading places with him, I mean, I knew that wasn't going to happen. And it dawned on me some time later that during the worst of that crisis, which is what makes it the worst, was not only that he was in pain, but that space in a diagnosis when you're so afraid, when you just don't know what's coming next. It feels like a catastrophe because every hour brings new news, and you don't know when that's going to stop happening. It's that space. I never once prayed for him to get better or for it to be taken away from him, other than that idea of trading it with me. I never prayed for him to be healed of it. It's interesting. It never occurred to me to pray that way for him. I felt a little silly when I realized that, and then I thought, well, but that's consistent with my faith and my theology. I very rarely in my prayers ask God for things. I don't know if I should be, well, proud is the wrong word anyway. I don't know how I present that to you other than just honestly. I was saying this to my dad yesterday. I said, I don't very often pray for things. I don't pray to win. In my hospice work, occasionally I would be with a family that was praying for a miracle, for someone to be healed of their, say, cancer, for example, or whatever it was that at this point gave them a diagnosis and a prognosis of less than 6 months. They were going to die. And the families were praying for a miracle, and I, as their chaplain, they would occasionally ask me to join them, and it was a very dicey space for me because I knew they were going to be listening if I was hedging my words in the prayer. And so I had to find the place in that prayer where I was joining them, because that was my motivation, was to join them. But I also knew that I really had no expectation as I prayed that God would take this disease away from somebody. I had come to terms in my own life, in my work as a hospice chaplain, that we all die. And many of us are not at all happy about that fact. And then ironically, as I was having this conversation with my dad yesterday, my 97-year-old dad, I said, actually, the prayers for God to change something that were most urgent and that I could really buy into in my hospice work was when a family tearfully looked at me at the bedside of a loved one who needed to die and couldn't die. I don't know if you know what I'm saying. Somebody who was in that last hours or maybe day or so of that awful breathing, and they needed to go, and there was no coming back from where they were, and everyone knew that. But the family was in pain and distress because they were watching at the bedside, and in their view, their loved one was suffering, and they said it just needs to stop. And they would say things, nice people, like if I could put a pillow over her face, I would. If I could just make it stop. Can we give her more of the morphine? We can't give her more than what the doctor has said. Would you pray for us? And then I found myself praying urgently, God, please take her. Please bring rest and peace. So that was kind of interesting for me to realize. That hadn't occurred to me until that conversation yesterday, that those are probably been my most urgent prayers, that God might change the health of someone or change something immediately, was that God would bring peace to someone who was trying to die, was dying, but it was taking too long. Kind of interesting. I see a lot of you nodding, and I hope that this is provoking thought in your own minds about prayer and about theology, really, because prayer comes right up against the question of what do we expect of God? What are we trying to accomplish in prayer? Why do you pray? While we were singing this morning, I was looking up here and I was looking, Gary played some kind of a lick on the guitar, and I looked up at him. There he is. I know. No, you weren't drawing attention to yourself. I'm teasing you. I looked past Gary to the beautiful window behind him. And you know this verse, don't you, from Revelation 3:20. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. And if anyone hear my voice and answer the door, I will come in to him or her. Most of the prayers here seem to be women. I will come in to her and dine with her and she with me. That's the verse. And so the image of this window is actually perfect for what I think of when I'm praying. In other words, God is very near, but there is an issue. There's a door between us, and the invitation is there for me to open the door. When I open the door, then there will be, who said it? Communion. Who used the word communion? I pray to be in communion. There it is. To pray to be in communion with God. In other words, you're looking for a word that's more than just communication. It's communion. It's like two old guys going fishing together, sitting in a boat, and they're not even talking. But they're together. That's why I called this sermon Friendship with God. There is the notion in contemplative prayer, and that's the kind of prayer that Aaron went to take the class about, and probably why he called me, and what I am probably supposed to talk about. So I will for just a couple of minutes. The notion of contemplative prayer is that we are trying to move, these are my words, from, and then I'll explain them. We're trying to move in our relationship with God from a transactional relationship to a relationship of trust. And so when you first meet somebody, you maybe they are an acquaintance of yours, an acquaintance. And an acquaintanceship with God might be like someone who drives by the street, looks over here and says, yeah, there's the Presbyterian Church. And they have a little bit of a feeling about that. Like, yeah, I used to go to church. I'm aware that there's God. I'm aware of God. I have an acquaintance with God, but not an active relationship, not something I'm trying to nurture. That would be, at this end, an acquaintance. And then if you take a little step further, maybe something happens in your life where you kind of need something. You kind of need something. And so that's the transactional part. And so you begin to pray and go to church and read the Bible, and you develop maybe a kind of a friendliness with God. More than an acquaintanceship, a bit of a connection. And you say you do it because I get this out of it. I pray because I get this out of it. That's the transactional part. I do this, and then I get this back. A friendship, so acquaintance, friendliness, friendship, moves a little bit farther yet. You might have people who are your friends that are good people or not good people, but you have this sense of a relationship with them. And you don't call them up because you need something. You call them up because you want to be with them. Can you feel the difference? You're moving from transactional to trust, or to communion. And then the main author and the main thinker in the world of contemplative prayer is Thomas Keating, and I have a couple of his books here with me, but he wrote one of his books is called Intimacy with God. And I would take that to the next step. Even beyond friendship is intimacy. And intimacy with God looks like this. I let go of my own. When I'm with God, what I want to do is give over to God all control of my life, all of my anxieties about security or whether I'm liked or whether I feel safe or really even happy. I have such trust that my life belongs to God that I'm prepared for it to go wherever God wants it to go. I don't believe anymore that I own my own life. It would be like opening this door and saying, Lord, come in. This is your house anyway. It's like opening the door and saying, not welcome into my house, but thank you that I get to have a meal with you. So intimacy with God begins to look different. Intimacy with God and communion with God is the goal of contemplative prayer. It's to develop the relationship to the point where, like the two old guys sitting in the boat together, you're not even talking. It's just being in each other's presence. That's enough. Thomas Keating said, God's first language is silence, and everything else is a poor translation. God's first language is silence, and everything else is a poor translation. So sometimes we say prayer is talking to God. Well, that's fine. And we all have people that are like that in relationships. What they want from us is for us to listen while they talk. That's fine. How boring for God if that's our main idea of what prayer is about. So God wants, I think, having created us for love, wants to be in love, wants to be in communion with us. And also, honestly, I think that's what we might want. So the goal in contemplative prayer is to learn to sit with God in silence, which is actually God's language. So what happens the minute you try to sit in silence and meditate? Is it easy? How does it go for you? Jabber, 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 jabber. Thought, 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 thought. Planning, planning, planning. Insights. Great thought. Jump up. Where's my phone? Facebook. Distractions, distractions, distractions. Very interesting. That actually is the discipline of contemplative prayers, to figure out how to move kind of with all of that and through it, and find the places of silence, which by definition equal opening the door, so that God, who is always right here, standing at the door and knocking, can come in and dine with you and you with God and have communion. Prayer is about forming that relationship with God, being in relationship, trying to do it in a way that doesn't just ask God to be what I need God to be, but actually tries to open myself up to the God who is God. God isn't just more than us. God is different from us in ways that we can't even imagine. Hence, all of our ideas of God actually distract us from God. So silence, so that we can begin to experience God really on God's own terms. And then, when that begins to happen, when you begin to build a relationship of trust with God, trusting God on God's own terms, then what happens in your life? Well, Thomas Merton said it like this. Here's my other quote for you this morning. Thomas Merton, great contemplative. If you trust God, everything that happens to you will bring you closer to God. If you don't trust God, nothing will. Thomas Merton. If you trust God, everything that happens to you will bring you closer to God. If you don't trust God, nothing will. And so prayer, contemplative prayer, the goal of it is to form a relationship with God on God's own terms. That's the trust part. In my hospice work, I know I'm going long, and I'm going to go back to the hospice piece because I promised myself I would say this to you. In my hospice work, I found that some people were very prepared to come closer to God as they died. They were looked forward to it. Very prepared for it. God was a comfort to them. Somebody said the word comfort over here. God had always provided them comfort, and that's what they expected, and that's what they wanted. God was a source of comfort. There were also people that were fundamentally alienated from God, were afraid of God, not comforted by the idea of being closer to God. Now here it is. Watch this. Watch this. That phenomenon of people who were comforted by God and people who were alienated from God did not correlate with whether or not people went to church. Did not correlate with whether people went to church. When I would come and meet people and find that they went to church or that they had been lifelong Christians, that predicted nothing for me about what I was going to find in their theology about whether they trusted or loved God, or whether they were prepared to go to God in their death. And I thought, holy cow, I see the look on your face, Gary. That surprised me. In hospice chaplaincy, that surprised me. And it also surprised me in a less offensive way when I found people outside the church who were ready to die and weren't really worried about it. That kind of surprised me because it kind of turned my theory upside down. But what surprised me and bothered me was people that had been in the church all their lives and who were not ready to die. And I came away from that realization thinking, well, then what's the point? If our faith isn't preparing us to die, we know we're going to die. If our faith isn't preparing us for that moment when we have to ultimately let go of everything and trust God, and if we're terrified, then what can we be doing about that? How can we begin to practice our faith in a way that will actually prepare us to die? Because guess what? It's going to happen to a couple of you. It's going to happen to all of us. So are you doing anything about that? And that's the challenge I kind of have for you, to build a relationship with God that might prepare you to die. The Bhutanese people, they live in the Himalayas outside of Nepal, Buddhists. They have a practice, their whole faith is based around reminding themselves 5 times a day, they don't read the Psalms, they're Buddhist. 5 times a day they remind themselves that they're going to die. And in a survey recently, this became kind of a thing a few years ago, that culture was rated as the happiest people on earth. Kind of interesting. They ponder their own death constantly, and there are monastic orders in the Christian world that do this also. Lift up death, and they live their life in the face of the knowledge of their own death. And it actually increases one's vitality. And I found this in hospice work. I love doing hospice work because it was real. When people know they're going to die, they become real. If they're afraid, then we can work on that. We can work on that. What are you doing to prepare yourself to die? If that's news to you that you might want to do this, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to break the bad news to you. But the God who made you, caused you to show up here, gave you a purpose, at some point wants to be even closer to you. And at some point your journey will come to a time of rest in God. And I do believe that you will find rest in God, whether you're afraid of that moment just ahead of time or not, actually. I just think it's going to be okay. But you might want to look to a prayer practice that starts now, releasing yourself to God. Saying, God, I don't know what today brings, but I belong to you, and thank you. Some of you think this is very weird that I'm talking about dying. I see it. Others of you are nodding with great comfort, and you're saying, bring it on. I'm going to close with the welcoming. It's called the welcoming prayer. I'm technologically savvy enough to have it in my phone, but not savvy enough to have figured out how to print it out. So I could go on the internet and find it and get it in my phone. I couldn't figure out how to print it out. This is the welcoming prayer that many of us use to set ourselves up. And you can actually Google the welcoming prayer, if you know how to Google. And Aaron will have this. So you start when you're going to pray by gently becoming aware of your body and your interior state. Gently. What's happening with me? Well, you sit there. What's happening with me right now? Anxious, impatient, bored. It's okay, just name it, just know it. And then the prayer. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I welcome everything that comes to me in this moment because I know it is for my healing. I welcome all thoughts, feelings, emotions, persons, situations, and conditions. I let go of my desire for security. I let go of my desire for approval. I let go of my desire for control. I let go of my desire to change any situation, condition, person, or myself. I open to the love and presence of God and the healing action and grace within.